In 1848, on a quiet Georgia plantation, the children of the house began waking at night to a sound they could not explain. Slow breathing beneath the stairs, the scrape of movement where no one should have been. Their mother insisted it was imagination. Their father never checked. But the children were right. Someone was hidden there, and the longer he stayed, the more the house itself seemed to change. What began as a secret meant to protect one enslaved man would slowly unravel an entire family, leaving behind whispers, fear, and a truth that was never written down before. We begin. Make sure you subscribe to Midnight Epoch, turn on the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end, because this story does not reveal its most unsettling truth until the final moments, when the silence finally explains itself. In 1848, the plantation house stood as it always had, wide, restrained, and watchful, set back from the red Georgia earth as though it did not fully trust the land beneath it. It was not the grandest house in the county, nor the oldest, but it had a presence that unsettled visitors without their understanding why. Those who stayed the night often remarked that sleep came slowly there, that the air felt heavier after dusk, as if the house itself drew a long breath and then refused to let it go. At the center of the structure rose the staircase, a curved spine of dark wood polished to a dull shine by years of passing feet. It split the house cleanly, guiding movement upward while concealing what lay beneath. The space under the stairs had been sealed long before the current family arrived, paneled over with thick boards that blended seamlessly into the wall, giving no indication that anything lay behind them. To most eyes, it was simply structure. To Margaret Hale, it was possibility. Margaret was the kind of woman history struggles to categorize. Not cruel enough to be remembered as monstrous, not brave enough to be praised as defiant. She moved through the world quietly, observing more than she spoke, correcting small things others overlooked. She noticed when the household rhythm faltered, when a servant limped, when an enslaved man returned from the fields slower than usual. Her husband, Thomas Hale, did not notice these things. He believed order existed because he expected it to. Margaret knew order had to be maintained. Isaiah had belonged to the plantation since before her marriage, a man whose usefulness had spared him the worst of field labor until it no longer did. When he was beaten for a mistake that may not have been his, Margaret saw the change immediately, not just in his body, but in the way he carried himself afterward, cautious, diminished, as though he had learned that visibility itself was dangerous. She did not speak to him then. She watched, she waited, and when she realized that the next punishment would not be survived, she did something that would alter the house forever. She hid him, not in the woods, not with false papers or whispered plans of escape. She hid him inside the structure of the home itself, beneath the staircase where sound traveled strangely and where no one ever looked. It was not an act born of courage, but of control. By hiding Isaiah there, Margaret believed she could preserve him without disrupting the world she depended on. She told herself this was mercy. The house accepted the secret without protest. Walls closed around it, floors carried weight above it, and Isaiah, lowered into darkness with a whispered instruction to remain silent, became part of the architecture, alive, breathing, unseen. From the very first night the house changed, not visibly, not immediately, but subtly, in ways that only those who lived there every day would feel. The staircase creaked differently. Sound lingered longer than it should have. At night, when the household settled, there was a sense of expectation, as though something beneath the routine waited to be acknowledged. Margaret lay awake those nights, listening for sounds she prayed she would not hear and feared she might. She told herself she was protecting Isaiah. She told herself this would be temporary. She told herself many things. The house listened and said nothing. Above Isaiah, life continued with disciplined normalcy. Meals were served, lessons were taught, orders were given, and beneath the stairs a man learned to measure time by footsteps, to count breaths so they would not betray him, to exist without being perceived. The children sensed the shift almost immediately, though they could not name it. Children are sensitive to imbalance, to changes adults dismiss as imagination. They felt it in the way the staircase seemed colder, in the way their mother corrected them more sharply when they played nearby, in the way night no longer felt empty. The house, once merely shelter, had become a container, and containers, once filled, are never the same again. Isaiah understood this before anyone else. Hidden does not mean safe, it means delayed, it means held in suspension, neither punished nor free. As he settled into the darkness beneath the stairs, listening to the household breathe above him, he realized that survival had taken on a new shape, one that required not strength or obedience, but disappearance. And in that disappearance, something essential began to shift, not just within him, but within the walls that now kept his secret. The house that held its breath had begun a long, quiet transformation, one that would not end with discovery, but with something far more lasting, the slow, irreversible contamination of silence. The first lesson Isaiah learned beneath the staircase was how to listen without hope, because hope made sound inside the chest, and sound was the enemy now. The space Margaret had chosen for him was narrower than it appeared from the outside, the sloping underside of the stairs pressing downward so that he could not fully stand upright, forcing his body into a permanent posture of submission that no overseer had ordered, but which the house itself enforced. The air smelled of old wood, polish, and the faint metallic trace of nails long driven into place, and when the door panel slid shut for the first time, the darkness arrived not gradually, but all at once, thick and absolute, swallowing depth and distance so completely that Isaiah had to reach out with his hands to confirm that the world still existed beyond his own skin. Margaret's instructions had been simple and terrifying in their simplicity. Remain silent, remain still, breathe shallowly at night, and never respond, no matter what he heard above him. She did not say how long this would last. She did not say what would happen if he was discovered. She spoke as though this were a pause in his life, not a transformation of it, and when the panel closed, Isaiah understood that whatever he had been before, field hand, laborer, visible man, had ended in that moment. Time beneath the stairs did not behave like time elsewhere. Without light, days could not be counted in the usual way. He learned instead to measure time by routine, the creak of the staircase at dawn when the household began to move, the lighter steps of the children rushing past after breakfast, the heavier, deliberate tread of Thomas Hale in the evening, returning from the fields or his accounts. Meals arrived irregularly at first, slipped through a narrow opening Margaret had insisted remain hidden behind a removable board, and Isaiah learned quickly to eat without sound, to swallow carefully, to wipe his hands on his trousers rather than risk the soft scrape of cloth against wood. Hunger was easier to manage than fear. Fear arrived at night when the house quieted and the smallest noise seemed magnified, when the absence of movement above him made his own breathing feel dangerously loud. He pressed his ear to the wood often, listening not just for footsteps, but for intention, trying to anticipate the rhythms of those Ho lived freely above him. He came to know the children's sleep patterns, the way one of them would rise once each night for water, the way another turned restlessly, causing the stairs to groan faintly as though protesting the weight of dreams. Margaret came less often after the first week, and when she did, her voice carried strain. She spoke in whispers, not to avoid being heard, no one else was near, but because whispering allowed her to believe this was still under her control. Isaiah listened to her words carefully, noting what she did not say. She never spoke of plans, she never spoke of escape, she spoke only of necessity, of waiting, of patience, and Isaiah understood that patience in this context meant endurance without promise. The house itself became his primary companion, its sounds and silences shaping his awareness. He learned that wood expands and contracts with temperature, that the staircase groaned differently in heat than in cold, that rain changed the way sound traveled through the structure, making footsteps softer, more diffuse. These details mattered. They allowed him to predict danger, to anticipate when someone lingered nearby. They also anchored him, giving his mind something to hold on to in a space designed to erase him. Above him, life continued with unsettling normalcy. Conversations drifted down through the boards, fragments of lessons, arguments, laughter, never intended for his ears but impossible for him to ignore. He learned the cadence of Margaret's voice when she was calm and when she was not, the clipped tone Thomas used when displeased, the careless confidence with which the children spoke of the world they assumed would always belong to them. Listening became both his burden and his connection, the only way he could confirm that time still moved forward. But listening also brought pain, because it reminded him constantly of his exclusion, of the life proceeding without him, of the fact that his existence had been reduced to something hidden, something shameful, something that could not be acknowledged openly without consequence. As days turned into weeks, Isaiah noticed a change in himself. His body adapted to the confinement, muscles tightening, movements becoming economical, but his mind began to shift in ways he could not immediately name. He found himself rehearsing silence even when no one was near, holding his breath unnecessarily, flinching at imagined sounds. He began to think of himself less as a man and more as a presence, an anomaly the house had absorbed. The knowledge that he was hidden by choice, that his concealment was an act decided by someone who still slept in comfort above him, complicated his feelings toward Margaret. He felt gratitude, yes, but also resentment, a quiet, simmering awareness that her mercy was conditional, that it depended on her ability to keep the secret intact without sacrificing her own position. He understood that if the choice ever came between his survival and her standing, the house would open for him only one way, outward, exposed, unprotected. At night, when the children's whispers drifted down, Isaiah felt a different kind of tension. Children notice patterns adults ignore, and he sensed their curiosity sharpening, their awareness narrowing in on the staircase. Once, when one of them pressed an ear against the wood directly above him, Isaiah froze so completely that his body ached, every muscle locked, breath suspended as though even his heartbeat might betray him. The child moved away eventually, but the moment lingered, imprinting itself on Isaiah's nerves. He realized then that concealment was not static. It required constant vigilance, constant adaptation. The house might hide him, but it also magnified the risk of discovery by placing him at the center of domestic life. Beneath the stairs, he was closer to the family than he had ever been in the fields, closer to their private rhythms, their vulnerabilities, their unguarded moments. This proximity did not humanize them for him. It sharpened the imbalance between their freedom and his restraint. As weeks turned into months, Isaiah's sense of time grew elastic, stretching and contracting unpredictably. Some days passed in a blur of waiting, others dragged with unbearable slowness. He marked changes by small shifts, a child's voice deepening slightly, Margaret's steps becoming heavier, Thomas's routine growing more irregular. These observations gave him a sense of continuity, but they also underscored his own stagnation. He was not aging in the same way. He was suspended, preserved in darkness, his life reduced to maintenance. The space beneath the stairs began to feel less like a hiding place and more like an extension of himself, an external manifestation of the constraint he carried internally. He understood then that even if he were to emerge one day, even if the panel were opened and he stepped back into the light, something essential would not return with him. The house had claimed it. The man beneath the steps was still alive, still breathing, still listening. But he was becoming something else, something shaped by absence, by enforced invisibility, by the knowledge that his survival depended not on justice or rightness, but on the continued willingness of a woman upstairs to pretend he was not there at all. The children did not discover Isaiah all at once, and they did not discover him with certainty. What they discovered instead was inconsistency, a quiet wrongness that settled into their days and refused to leave, beginning as a feeling rather than a fact. As most truths do when adults work hard to hide them. It started with sound, not a voice, not footsteps, but something softer and more difficult to argue away, the faint, rhythmic presence of breathing that did not belong to anyone visible. At first it was noticed only at night, when the house relaxed into stillness and every small noise gained importance. The youngest child woke crying one evening, insisting that the stairs were awake, that something under them was moving. Margaret dismissed it gently, attributing the fear to dreams, to shadows cast by moonlight through the windows, to the ordinary creaks of an old house. The explanation should have been sufficient. It was not. Children accept simple answers only when those answers align with their senses, and their senses were telling them something else. Over the following weeks, the sounds became more distinct, or perhaps the children became better listeners. They heard a pause in the quiet that felt intentional, a careful restraint that suggested awareness. One child, braver or perhaps more reckless than the others, lay flat on the floor one afternoon, pressing an ear against the wood at the base of the staircase, and reported that he could hear someone waiting. The phrase unsettled Margaret more than any accusation could have, because it implied not imagination but perception. She corrected him sharply, her voice carrying an edge it rarely held, and the child learned something important in that moment, not about the house, but about silence. He learned that this was not a subject to pursue openly. Still, awareness, once sparked, does not extinguish easily. The children began to adjust their behavior in small, instinctive ways, lingering near the staircase longer than necessary, dropping objects on the steps and listening for a response, inventing games that required repeated trips past the hidden panel. They did not know what they were seeking. They only knew something was there. At night, their imaginations filled the gaps left by adult denial, and their fears took shape in whispers exchanged under blankets, in half-formed theories about ghosts or animals trapped inside the walls. The idea of a hidden person did not occur to them at first, not because they could not imagine it, but because such a truth had no place in the version of the world they had been taught to expect. Isaiah felt their ceased curiosity like pressure, a tightening in the air beneath the stairs that made breathing more difficult. He learned to anticipate their movements, to recognize the difference between the careless steps of play and the deliberate slowness of listening. When they lingered too close, he froze completely, holding himself rigid even when muscles burned, even when the urge to shift position became overwhelming. He understood that discovery by children would not be safer than discovery by adults. Children asked questions. Children told truths without understanding the consequences. Their innocence made them dangerous. Above him, the house absorbed their growing unease. The staircase, once simply a passage, became a focal point, its presence magnified by attention. Sounds that had always existed, the settling of wood, the contraction of beams as temperatures changed, were now interpreted through suspicion, each noise carrying the potential to confirm what the children already believed. Margaret responded by tightening control, restricting play, redirecting energy, insisting on order where disorder threatened exposure. Her vigilance did not reassure the children, it confirmed their instincts. They sensed that the staircase was important in a way they were not allowed to understand. Thomas Hale noticed none of this. When the children complained of noises, he laughed and told stories of haunted houses from his own childhood, stories meant to entertain rather than explain. He walked the stairs heavily, deliberately, as though asserting ownership over them, and declared the matter settled. His confidence reassured him alone. The children watched him pass over the hidden space without awareness and learned another lesson, that authority did not guarantee understanding. At night, when the house fell quiet again, their attention sharpened. They heard the subtle sounds Isaiah could not fully suppress, the careful shift of weight when pain became unbearable, the faint exhale when he believed no one listened. These sounds did not frighten them in the way a sudden noise might have. They unsettled them more deeply, because they suggested intent, restraint, a presence trying not to be noticed. One child began to leave small objects near the stairs, marbles, scraps of paper, toys, marking their position deliberately so they could tell if anything moved them. When nothing did, the absence of change felt almost like confirmation. The presence was careful, it was controlled, it was waiting. Over time, the children's fear transformed into something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, dread, and a strange sense of responsibility. They felt watched but not threatened. The presence beneath the stairs did not feel hostile, it felt constrained. This perception confused them because they had been taught to associate hidden things with danger, not with restraint. Their dreams began to reflect this confusion. They dreamed of people trapped behind walls, of voices that could not speak loudly, of doors that opened only partway. They woke unsettled, unable to articulate why these dreams felt different from ordinary nightmares. Margaret noticed the change in them, their quietness, their reluctance to pass the staircase alone, and felt the weight of her decision press harder. The secret she had created was no longer contained. It had entered the minds of her children, shaping their fears, altering their sense of safety. She began to realize that hiding Isaiah had not removed him from the household dynamic. It had woven him into it in a way that could not be easily undone. Isaiah, listening to the children's movements and murmurs, experienced a painful inversion of his former life. In the fields he had been visible but unheard. Beneath the stairs he was unheard but intensely perceived. The children sensed his existence without knowing his identity, and in that sense they understood his condition more accurately than the adults ever would. He was there, but not ignored. DG'd, present but denied. This mirrored his broader existence as an enslaved man so precisely that it felt almost intentional, as though the house itself were teaching a lesson no one had planned. As the weeks passed, the children stopped reporting the sounds. This worried Isaiah more than their curiosity ever had. Silence, in children, often signals adaptation rather than acceptance. They had incorporated the presence beneath the stairs into their understanding of the house, adjusting their behavior accordingly. They avoided certain areas at night. They spoke more softly. They learned, without being told, that some truths existed but were not meant to be named. In doing so, they absorbed a lesson far older than the house itself, a lesson about power and denial, about the coexistence of knowledge and silence. Isaiah felt this shift acutely. The children were no longer a threat of sudden exposure. They were witnesses, silent ones, constrained by rules they did not fully understand, but obeyed nonetheless. This realization brought him no comfort. Being known without being acknowledged is its own form of erasure. The house continued to hold its breath, the staircase standing as both barrier and conduit, and beneath it, Isaiah remained suspended between discovery and disappearance, listening as the children learned, far too early, how to live alongside a truth they were never meant to confront openly. A secret, once established, does not remain fixed. It shifts its weight, redistributes pressure, and demands constant adjustment from everyone who carries it, whether they acknowledge it or not. By the time the children stopped asking questions, the secret beneath the staircase had already begun to transform the household in ways Margaret could no longer fully control. What she had imagined as a temporary measure, a holding place, a pause, had become a condition of daily life, shaping routines, altering instincts, and bending the architecture of the home around itself. Margaret found herself planning her days not by meals or social obligations, but by proximity, how long she could remain near the staircase without arousing suspicion, how often she could bring food without patterns becoming visible, how to correct the children without drawing their attention back to the very thing she wished to conceal. Her movements grew deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though she were acting out a role rather than living naturally. The house responded to this tension subtly. Doors were closed more often. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evening. Servants were redirected away from the central hall under the pretense of cleanliness or order. Margaret told herself these changes were minor, necessary, invisible to anyone who did not already know what to look for. But secrets have a way of announcing themselves through excess caution. The more she tried to contain the hidden man beneath the stairs, the more the house itself seemed organized around his absence, his invisibility becoming a structuring force rather than a concealed anomaly. Isaiah felt this shift acutely. He sensed when Margaret lingered nearby too long, when her steps betrayed hesitation rather than purpose. He learned to recognize the sound of her breathing when she was anxious, the slight tremor in her voice when she whispered instructions or apologies through the narrow opening. Her visits became less frequent, not because she cared less, but because the cost of maintaining them had risen. Each trip carried risk now, not just of discovery, but of self-revelation. Isaiah understood that she was no longer simply hiding him, she was hiding the fact that she was hiding him. This distinction mattered. It meant that her primary concern had shifted inward, toward the preservation of her own moral coherence. She needed to believe that what she was doing remained manageable, controlled, righteous. The longer Isaiah remained beneath the stairs, the harder that belief became to sustain. Above him, the children's behavior had changed in ways that unsettled her deeply. They were quieter, more cautious, their play constrained by unspoken boundaries. They avoided the staircase at night without explanation, as though an instinct had taken root that no correction could dislodge. Margaret watched this transformation with growing unease. She had intended to shield them from cruelty, to prevent them from witnessing brutality. Instead, she'd introduced a different kind of fear, an ambient unease that could not be named or resolved. The secret had not protected their innocence, it had reshaped it. Thomas Hale noticed the changes only insofar as they disrupted efficiency. He remarked on Margaret's nervousness, on the children's reluctance to move freely through the house, on the servants' confusion at her increasingly specific instructions. He attributed these disruptions to illness, to temperament, to the natural strains of managing a household. His failure to perceive the underlying cause did not diminish its impact, it amplified it. The secret thrived in the gap between his authority and his attention, exploiting his certainty that nothing significant could occur without his knowledge. Margaret relied on this certainty even as it repelled her. She found herself resenting his obliviousness while depending on it, trapped in a contradiction that mirrored Isaiah's own condition beneath the stairs. The house itself seemed to participate in this tension. Sounds traveled farther now, carried along corridors that had once absorbed them. The staircase creaked unpredictably, no longer responding consistently to weight or movement, as had become an unintentional teacher. Lessons advancing, voices maturing, personalities forming, while his contracted further. He listened to their growth with a mix of affection and grief, knowing that he occupied a formative place in their childhood without ever being acknowledged as a person. They knew him only as a presence, a constraint, a reason for unease. That knowledge weighed heavily on him. He did not want to be a source of fear, yet his existence beneath the stairs made fear unavoidable. The house itself seemed to amplify this imbalance. Seasons passed, marked for Isaiah only by changes in temperature and the quality of sound. Summer brought suffocating heat beneath the stairs, the air growing thick and stagnant, sweat dampening his clothes constantly. Winter brought cold that seeped through the wood, numbing his fingers, stiffening his joints further. Each seasonal shift reminded him of his exclusion from the natural rhythms of life. He did not feel rain on his skin. He did not see leaves change color. These absences accumulated, creating a sense that time itself was slipping past him, leaving him behind in a perpetual present of waiting. Margaret's internal struggle deepened in parallel. She had begun to notice changes in herself, irritability, fatigue, a tendency to avoid certain parts of the house. She justified these symptoms as the strain of domestic responsibility, but in quieter moments she recognized their true source. The secret demanded constant vigilance, and vigilance erodes ease. She found herself snapping at servants for minor infractions, correcting the children sharply, retreating from social interactions that might invite scrutiny. Her world narrowed as Isaiah's had, though in a different way. She too was constrained now, bound by the need to maintain concealment. This mutual confinement created a twisted symmetry between them, one neither would acknowledge. Margaret sometimes stood near the staircase at night, listening, not for sound but for reassurance. When she heard nothing, she felt relief mixed with guilt, aware that his silence, which protected her, came at great personal cost to him. She told herself again that this was better than the alternative, that exposure would mean violence, separation, death. These thoughts allowed her to continue, but they did not absolve her. Isaiah sensed her ambivalence even without seeing her. The cadence of her steps, the way she lingered and then retreated, conveyed her uncertainty. He understood that his fate rested not on justice, not on law, but on her ability to endure the psychological burden of her own decision. This realization stripped away any lingering illusion of agency. He was no longer waiting for rescue or resolution. He was waiting for collapse, of her resolve, of the household's balance, of the fragile structure of denial holding everything in place. The cost of being kept was not only physical or emotional, it was existential. Isaiah's sense of self began to fray. Without interaction, without acknowledgement, identity grew thin. He spoke aloud to himself rarely now, afraid of the sound of his own voice, afraid that hearing it would remind him too sharply of what he had lost. He began to think of himself less in terms of name or history, and more in terms of function. He was the one beneath the stairs, the one who must remain still. This reduction was subtle but devastating. It represented a deeper success of the system that confined him, his internalization of invisibility. Above him, the children reached an age where their curiosity had matured into something quieter, more watchful. They no longer sought confirmation, they accepted the presence beneath the stairs as a given, an unspoken rule of the house. This acceptance disturbed Isaiah profoundly. It meant that the secret had been normalized, that the extraordinary had become ordinary. The cost of this normalization was borne by everyone, but most heavily by him. The longer he remained hidden, the harder it became to imagine a future in which he would re-enter the world without carrying the imprint of this confinement. He understood now that even if he were released, even if the panel were opened and he stepped back into the light, he would not simply resume his former life. The experience beneath the stairs had already altered him irreversibly. The cost of being kept was not something that could be repaid or undone. It was cumulative, shaping his body, his mind, his sense of worth. And as the house continued to function above him, sustained by silence and denial, Isaiah endured with the grim clarity of someone who knows that survival, in this form, is not a gift freely given, but a debt that extracts its payment every single day. The moment the children stopped asking questions was not marked by silence, but by adjustment, and adjustment is often more unsettling than fear because it signals acceptance of a reality that should never have been normal. At first, Isaiah believed the quiet meant safety, that the danger of sudden discovery had passed, that the children's curiosity had burned itself out. But as weeks turned into months, he realized the truth was far more complicated. The children had not forgotten what they sensed beneath the stairs, they had incorporated it into their understanding of the house, the way one learns to live with a drafty room or a door that never closes properly. They altered their movements instinctively, stepping lightly near the staircase at night, avoiding loud games in the central hall, lowering their voices without being told. Isaiah could hear it in the difference between careless noise and deliberate restraint. What frightened him was not that they knew something was there, but that they had learned not to name it. In that lesson taught without words, Isaiah recognized the same logic that governed his own existence as an enslaved man. Some truths are acknowledged only through behavior, never speech, because speech invites consequence. The children's silence mirrored the silence forced upon him, and in that reflection, the secret beneath the stairs deepened its hold on the household. Margaret noticed the change as well, though she misinterpreted it at first as obedience, as maturity. She told herself the children had outgrown their fears, that the house had settled back into order. But the order she sensed was brittle, dependent on restraint rather than comfort. The children did not run freely through the house anymore. They avoided certain areas after dark, not with panic, but with caution. Their play had become contained, bounded by invisible rules. Margaret felt a quiet unease when she observed this, an awareness that something essential had been lost, though she could not admit that it was innocence she herself had compromised. She told herself that all households carried unspoken rules, that this was merely one of them. Above Isaiah, the air of the house grew heavier, not with overt tension, but with a constant, low-level vigilance. The children listened now not out of curiosity, but habit, their senses attuned to changes in the house's rhythm. They noticed when the staircase sounded different, when a floorboard creaked out of sequence, when the silence beneath the steps felt more concentrated. These perceptions did not prompt questions. They prompted avoidance. Isaiah felt their awareness like a presence pressing down on him from above, not threatening but inescapable. He was no longer merely hidden, he was known in a way that stripped him of agency. Being unseen had once offered a fragile form of protection. Being silently acknowledged offered none. The children's adaptation forced Isaiah to confront a painful truth. The secret had succeeded. It had taught them how to live alongside injustice without challenging it, how to accommodate discomfort rather than confront its cause. This realization weighed on him more heavily than the physical confinement ever had. He had become part of their moral education, a lay, in denial encoded into their daily lives. The house reinforced this lesson constantly. Its sounds and spaces now functioned as reminders of what was not to be discussed. The staircase stood unchanged, polished and ordinary, concealing beneath it a reality that shaped everyone's behavior without ever being acknowledged. At night, when the children lay awake in their rooms, Isaiah could sense their awareness sharpen, not toward discovery, but toward restraint. They had learned that the house required certain silences to remain intact. Margaret, too, had adapted in her own way. Her vigilance became less frantic, more resigned. She no longer hovered near the staircase as often, no longer corrected the children as sharply. Instead, she relied on the unspoken rules that had taken root. The house, she realized, now policed itself. The children's behavior reduced the risk of exposure more effectively than her constant supervision ever could. This realization brought her a grim relief, accompanied by a deeper guilt she refused to examine too closely. She sensed that the secret had crossed a threshold, becoming embedded in the household's functioning rather than existing as an anomaly she actively managed. Isaiah understood this shift intuitively. The pattern of his days changed subtly. He heard Margaret less often. Food still arrived, but with increasing regularity and decreasing interaction, as though the act had become procedural rather than personal. He was being maintained, not cared for. The absence of conversation stripped away any remaining illusion of connection. His world narrowed further, reduced to sound, breath, and endurance. The children's presence, once a source of acute danger, became a constant reminder of his erasure. They knew he was there, yet they did not acknowledge him as a person. To them, he was part of the house's strange interior life, like a draft that could not be sealed, or a noise that could not be traced. This transformation hurt Isaiah in ways he struggled to articulate even to himself. He did not resent the children, he pitied them. They were learning, too early, how to live with contradictions that adults refused to resolve. At night, Isaiah sometimes imagined speaking aloud, calling to them, asserting his humanity. He imagined the shock, the disruption, the forced reckoning that would follow. But he never did it. He knew the cost would be unbearable, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The system that confined him depended on silence, and breaking that silence would trigger violence far beyond his control. His restraint, then, became another lesson absorbed by the household, that survival often requires complicity. This understanding hollowed him out further, eroding the sense that endurance itself was virtuous. Above him, the children grew older, their voices changing, their movements more assured. Their fear receded, replaced by a normalized caution. They accepted the presence beneath the stairs as part of the house's character, something to be worked around rather than addressed. This acceptance disturbed Isaiah profoundly. It meant the secret had outlived its initial urgency, had become sustainable. The longer it persisted, the less likely it was to be challenged. Margaret sensed this too, though she framed it differently in her mind. She told herself that as long as the house functioned, as long as no one was harmed openly, the arrangement could continue. She did not consider that harm was already occurring, quietly, continuously, beneath her feet. The house itself seemed to endorse this logic, standing solid and unchanging, its architecture concealing the cost of its order. Isaiah's internal world shifted in response. He began to think less about escape or exposure, and more about endurance as a finite resource. He wondered how long a person could exist in this state without dissolving entirely into function. He felt his sense of self thinning, his memories losing sharpness, his emotions flattening into a steady, manageable numbness. This numbness protected him from despair, but it also frightened him, because it suggested a future in which he would survive without truly living. When children stop asking questions, it is often because they have learned which questions threaten the stability of their world. Isaiah understood that the household had reached this stage. The secret beneath the stairs no longer provoked inquiry, because inquiry had been trained out of those who sensed it. This was the system at work, operating not through force alone, but through adaptation, normalization, and silence. As Isaiah lay awake in the darkness, listening to the measured breathing of the house above him, he realized that the most enduring prisons are not built of walls alone, but of habits, habits of avoidance, of restraint, of accepting what should never be acceptable. And in that realization, heavy and inescapable, he sensed that whatever end awaited him would not come through sudden discovery, but through something quieter, something that would feel, to those above him, like an ordinary change in routine. By the time Isaiah realized the house had begun to forget him, the change had already settled too deeply to be reversed, And forgetting, he learned, does not arrive as absence but as transformation, as a gradual smoothing of edges until what once felt urgent becomes background, indistinguishable from the structure itself. The children, now older, moved through the house with a confidence that came not from innocence but from familiarity, their bodies navigating around the staircase without hesitation, their steps automatically adjusting in ways they no longer consciously registered. What had once caused pauses, glances, or hushed whispers had become a non-event, absorbed into muscle memory. Isaiah could hear this forgetting in the rhythm of their footsteps, in the way their laughter carried farther down the hall before being restrained, in the way nighttime silence felt less alert and more routine. It was not that the house had grown safer for him, it was that his presence no longer registered as a disruption. He had become infrastructure. This realization struck Isaiah with a quiet horror that eclipsed even his earlier fear of discovery. To be hunted is to be acknowledged, to be forgotten is to be erased while still breathing. Above him, life progressed with subtle markers of time, voices deepened, routines shifted, responsibilities changed. But beneath the stairs, time lost its shape. Isaiah measured days by food deliveries that grew increasingly mechanical, by the absence of Margaret's voice, by the rare occasions when someone paused on the staircase for reasons entirely unrelated to him. Margaret herself had changed in ways Isaiah could not see, but could sense through absence. Her visits became infrequent, her careful listening replaced by trust in the system she had helped create. She no longer checked the boards as often, no longer lingered near the staircase with the strained attention of someone guarding a fragile secret. The house, she believed, had stabilized. This belief allowed her to forget the daily cost of that stability. Isaiah's survival no longer required her constant vigilance, therefore, it no longer required her constant moral reckoning. In relinquishing oversight, she relinquished responsibility, and the secret beneath the stairs drifted from deliberate act to inherited condition. The children absorbed this shift intuitively. They no longer thought of the presence beneath the stairs as something their mother managed. It was simply there, like a closed room no one entered, or a rule no one explained. Isaiah could hear them discuss future plans, speak of leaving the house one day, of building lives elsewhere. And in those conversations, he realized something devastating. The secret would not follow them. They would leave with habits shaped by his confinement, but without memory of its cause. The hows. Would keep him. They would carry only the lesson. This understanding hollowed Isaiah in a way confinement alone never had. He had once imagined that if he endured long enough, someone might be forced to confront what had been hidden. Instead, endurance had rendered him invisible in a deeper sense, dissolving his presence into the house's routine. The house itself seemed to assist in this erasure. Sounds that once felt amplified now faded into the general creaking and settling of wood. Isaiah's movements, carefully restrained, blended seamlessly into the building's nocturnal noises. Even his breathing felt absorbed by the structure, as though the walls themselves inhaled and exhaled on his behalf. He began to feel less like a person occupying space and more like a void the house had learned to accommodate. This psychological shift altered his internal landscape profoundly. Memories of life before the staircase grew distant, less vivid, not because he forgot them, but because they no longer seemed connected to the present. The man who had once worked in the fields, who had spoken freely with others, who had possessed a body that moved through open air, felt like someone Isaiah had known rather than someone he still was. His sense of self fractured along temporal lines, leaving him anchored only to the immediate demands of survival. This fragmentation was not sudden, it unfolded gradually, mirroring the house's forgetting. The longer he remained hidden, the less disruptive his existence felt, both to those above him and dangerously to himself. He caught himself thinking of the space beneath the stairs, not as confinement, but as his place, a thought that alarmed him, even as it brought a strange, unwanted comfort. Above him, the household continued to function with remarkable efficiency. New routines formed, old ones faded, and the secret remained intact not because it was actively protected, but because it no longer challenged anything. Isaiah understood then that secrets do not need constant defense if they become irrelevant to daily operation. The moral weight of his confinement had been redistributed across time until it felt negligible, diluted by repetition. Margaret's conscience, once sharp with fear and control, had dulled into something like resignation. She did not reflect on Isaiah often anymore, and when she did, it was with a sense of distance, as though considering an obligation already fulfilled rather than a harm ongoing. This psychological distancing allowed her to function without constant discomfort, a survival strategy that mirrored Isaiah's own emotional numbing. Both captor and captive had adapted, each in their own way, to a reality that required denial to persist. The house, standing at the center of this adaptation, became an accomplice through neutrality. It did not protest, it endured. Isaiah's awareness of this dynamic deepened his despair, but also sharpened his understanding of the system that had placed him there. He saw clearly now that the greatest cruelty was not the initial act of hiding him beneath the stairs, but the normalization that followed, the way extraordinary injustice was rendered ordinary through time. This realization did not inspire rebellion, it inspired clarity. Isaiah no longer fantasized about sudden rescue or dramatic exposure. Instead, he began to think about legacy, about what traces of his existence might remain once he was gone. He wondered whether the house would remember him in any tangible way, whether some subtle flaw or sound would persist as evidence that a man had lived and suffered within its walls. He imagined future occupants sensing something off without knowing why, inheriting the residue of a silence they did not create. This thought offered a bleak comfort, that forgetting is never complete, that even normalized injustice leaves behind distortions. As Isaiah lay awake night after night, listening to the house settle around him, he felt himself becoming quiet. Not just in sound, but in thought. His internal monologue slowed, his emotions flattened further, as though his mind were conserving energy for an end he could sense approaching but not define. The house's forgetting did not mean he would vanish abruptly, it meant he would fade gradually, his presence becoming less and less distinguishable from the space that contained him. Above him, life continued, indifferent, not out of malice, but out of habituation. This indifference, Isaiah realized, was the true measure of the system's success. It did not require constant enforcement, it required only time. The house had learned to forget because forgetting allowed it to function smoothly, to maintain the illusion of order and respectability. And as the house forgot, so too did those who lived within it, leaving Isaiah suspended in a state that was neither acknowledged nor resolved. In this suspension, he sensed that the end, when it came, would not arrive with discovery or confrontation, but with something quieter still, an administrative decision, a practical adjustment, a change justified as necessary and inevitable. The house, having absorbed him so completely, would release him not with drama, but with efficiency, and that knowledge, heavy and cold, settled into Isaiah's bones as he waited, listening, as the structure above him breathed on, unchanged. When the end finally came, it did not announce itself, because endings of this kind rarely do. They arrive disguised as routine, as practicality, as a decision made for reasons that sound reasonable enough to silence objection, and Isaiah sensed it before it happened, not through sound or movement, but through a shift in the house's attention, as though the structure that had held him for so long had begun at last to loosen its grip. It began with absence. The food came later than usual one evening, then not at all the next, and Isaiah, long accustomed to interpreting patterns, understood this not as neglect but as transition. Margaret did not come to the staircase anymore. Her footsteps no longer paused above him. When she passed through the hall, she moved with a purpose that suggested closure rather than vigilance. The house felt different, not emptier but resolved. Isaiah did not panic. Panic belonged to earlier versions of himself, to the man who still believed that exposure or escape might define his fate. Now, he waited, because waiting was what the house had trained him to do, and because waiting, he understood, was how systems finalize what they have normalized. Above him, the household prepared for change. There were discussions Isaiah could not hear clearly, but could sense through movement. Furniture shifted, rooms emptied, voices carried with an unfamiliar decisiveness. The children, now nearly grown, spoke of departures, of futures elsewhere, of leaving the plantation behind. None of these conversations included him, not because he was intentionally excluded, but because he no longer existed as a factor in their thinking. He had been fully absorbed into the house's past, something already accounted for, something already resolved in their minds. This realization no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, it brought a strange clarity. Isaiah understood that his story would not end with recognition, that no one would look beneath the staircase and gasp at what had been hidden there for so long. The system did not require witnesses to complete its work. It required only continuity. On the final night, the house was unusually quiet, not the alert silence of secrecy, but the settled quiet of conclusion. Isaiah lay awake, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the structure that had become his world, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to no longer be held in place by its expectations. When footsteps finally came, they were not hurried, they were not cautious, they were efficient. Boards were removed, not wit. Shock, but with purpose, as though the space beneath the stairs was simply another compartment, long overdue for inspection. Isaiah did not resist, he did not speak. He understood that speaking now would not reclaim anything that had been lost. He was led out not into confrontation, but into process, his removal framed as necessity rather than reckoning. There was no dramatic exposure, no moment of realization for those who saw him. To them, he was not a revelation, he was a complication finally addressed. And in that moment, Isaiah recognized the final cruelty of his confinement, that even his emergence could be rendered unremarkable. What followed was brief and indistinct, not because it lacked consequence, but because it followed the same logic that had governed his captivity: quiet decisions made without consultation, actions justified by convenience rather than humanity. Isaiah's fate was sealed not by hatred, but by indifference perfected through time. The house, meanwhile, absorbed his absence as readily as it had absorbed his presence. The space beneath the stairs was repurposed, cleaned, smoothed over, its boards replaced and polished until no trace of disturbance remained. The staircase returned to its role as architectural feature, no longer concealing a secret, yet permanently altered by having done so. Those who left the house carried with them no explicit memory of Isaiah, only habits shaped by years of avoidance, restraint, and unspoken acceptance. They would not speak of him because they did not think of him as a person who had lived among them, but as a condition that had existed and then ceased. The house stood on, unchanged to the casual eye, but never truly empty of what it had contained. Long after the family was gone, long after new occupants passed through its halls, the structure retained subtle distortions, sounds that lingered a fraction too long, drafts that moved against logic, a staircase that seemed to command an unconscious respect. Future children would hesitate there without knowing why. Future adults would remark that the house felt heavy, that sleep came uneasily, that something about the central hall resisted comfort. They would never uncover the full truth, but they would sense its residue, because injustice, once normalized, leaves marks that architecture cannot erase. Isaiah's life did not end with vindication, but it did not vanish either. It remained embedded in the house's atmosphere, in the habits it taught, in the silences it required. His story became one of many that history does not record directly but transmits indirectly, through unease, through distortion, through the quiet knowledge that something was once wrong here and never fully addressed. The house learned to forget Isaiah in name and form, but it could not forget the shape of his absence. That shape persisted, a negative space that altered every life that passed through it, whether they understood it or not, and that perhaps was the only form of testimony left to him, not spoken, not written, but felt. Before this story ends, if you felt the weight of that silence, if you sensed how easily cruelty becomes ordinary when no one insists on naming it, then take a moment now to subscribe to Midnight Epoch, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us, because these are the stories history often hides in plain sight. And leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affected you, because remembering, even in fragments, is how silence begins to lose its power.